first question, which is pretty simple, which is why should we support you?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having all of us here to give us a chance to talk about our vision for the District of Columbia and how we can advance not just the interest of the WTU, but the interest of education policy for the district as a whole. My name is Karim D. Marshall. I am a proud third-generation Washingtonian and a very, very proud and grateful product of the District of Columbia Public Schools. I went to Malcolm X for pre-K, Magogny and Ambeers for elementary, Francis for middle school, Banneker for high school. And that constellation of preparation and investment by teachers, District of Columbia public servants, is what gave me the basis to allow me to succeed at Dartmouth and come back to DC to become a successful attorney. The reason you should support me is because what's most important to me is I am approaching this from a perspective of an irreconcilable debt. I owe so much to the teachers who took not just their job, but extra time out of their lives to pour into me. And I wasn't a particularly perfectly well-behaved child, who were patient enough with me to give me second or third chances to set me up so that I could be successful. And if you support me, you will have no stronger champion for education on the council than anyone
My
else.
question is, what would your vision for school governance in DC look like?
And we'll be starting with Karim.
Okay, so I think the most important thing to start with is an understanding that we need to build a system that works for all of our students. And I think we can look at what's happened over the last couple of years, particularly because of the misfeasance and misapplication and misappropriation of funds. We've lost like at least 5.3 million that we know of from a couple of mismanagements in the charter school system. I think we need to be looking at this from the perspective of how do we have a system that works for all of our students? So for me, this system works best if we have a single person in charge of the system that we can hold accountable. And we can have a conversation about whether or not that person is a mayor or a professionalized chancellor or a professionalized superintendent, where we can be a little bit more prescriptive about what their qualifications are, whether or not they're suited or suitable to be able to lead a cadre of educators. But that's a conversation I want to have around details. I think we need to have a state board that is very much active in making sure that smart policies are being set around education. And then we need to actually have a council that does the oversight it's supposed to do. The fact that we haven't had an oversight committee in the council for 6 years that's been effective is a little troublesome to me. I feel like the council has abrogated its duty in being a part of that responsibility.
What strategies will you employ to ensure you're actively supporting each ward regarding their educational needs?
As far as strategies, I think the most important thing that we can do regarding governance of DCPS is to be smarter about the way we budget. There's a bunch of operational changes that we can probably make that would improve the ability of us to operate on a day-to-day basis. But, and again, I know you're going to hear a lot of the council has failed us, the council has let us down. But in this case, I think there's been a real problem with the fact that we haven't had an education committee in 6 years. If we are really serious about doing the job of the council actually overseeing education, there needs to be a standalone committee, and that standalone committee needs to be empowered to work with all the stakeholders and to make sure that we have a plan for what it means to make sure that our students are educated, our teachers are respected, and our facilities are kept up to date. And without that, we're going to have more of the same and more excuses in 2 more years.
There is a pattern of behavior in DC where contract negotiations go years past the contract expiration date. How would you improve collaborative and timely collective bargaining agreements between DC agencies and respective unions?
I think the challenge with this is that every year the council sends over a series of questions to agencies. And one of the questions that they ask are, do you have enough resources to meet your statutory obligations? They ask the question and they know that the answers are going to get filtered through the mayor's office. They know that the agency has to say yes, or they have to deal with some issues around their reporting chain. So if you see that they aren't able to meet their mission and they tell you that they have enough resources to meet their mission, why are we pretending like this answer is truthful? We know they don't have enough staff. Now, I worked as a legislative director for an agency for about 5 years, and I know what it's like to have that negotiation with the union. And when I was an attorney for DPW for 2 years, I understand how important that bargaining agreement is to be able to make sure that the rules are clear. So what I'm saying is, if you know that they're backlogged, we need to start something like delay clauses. And this is the advantage of actually putting a practicing attorney on the council, is that there are solutions for this. You can look to the way in which we operate, and we know that there's a gap. You can fill that gap with a delay clause so that at least the pay can increase over time until the new terms are negotiated.
It is a question about just your connection, your personal connection to DC public schools. So it is kind of, do you have children? And if so, are they in DCPS? And if it is DCPS, what's been your engagement with that school? And for those of you who don't, could you just tell us about how you have engaged with DC public schools in particular?
I'm a product of DCPS, and I'm very proud of that fact. So that's my emotional connection. But I remember how important it was for me to be able to walk to school. Like being able to walk to school in elementary school, I remember it being a very stabilizing influence on my life, especially around fourth grade. So the way I engage currently is I've got a 2-year-old, and my wife and I are frankly terrified of the lottery system. We don't think that going to a school that is adequately resourced should be a matter of chance. I think that all of our schools need to be adequately resourced. We need to make sure that every school, every teacher, every classroom has what they need. And if I'm your next council member, I will make sure that teachers don't have to come out of their pockets in order to decorate their classrooms, that our teachers aren't impoverishing themselves to make sure that there's a healthy and constructive learning environment for their students. That's something the city should be taking care of. And finally, one of the things that I used to do to volunteer, I used to read with Everyone Wins Before the pandemic. So before I had a child of my own, I was reading to other young children in schools to make sure that they had that early intervention in literacy.
There's never been a generation of students more tested than current K-12 students. Most schools plan little instruction in the fourth quarter because of all the end of year testing. And this year, elementary schools are reporting that they're required to test every week. So what is your position on testing, the number of tests and instructional days lost to testing, as well as coming back to the one that's still open, the fact that students took a test coming right out of the pandemic and have then been held accountable for it at the school level?
I heard a saying once that stuck with me. Everyone has their own type of genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's gonna think it's an idiot. I believe that one of the flaws that we have in our testing methodology, and I say this as somebody who is really good at standardized tests, but we rely too much on one type of test to evaluate the progress of someone against learning objectives. It's 2022. We have to figure out a way to track and evaluate and measure the progress of our students in a way that doesn't rely on them filling in bubbles on a test. We have options available to us. There's a lot of studies on ways that we can actually evaluate and measure tests, or evaluate and measure progress that is not just relying on standardized tests. So I think we need to be more creative in working with our federal partners to make sure we're meeting those requirements to keep our funding, but also making sure that we're giving our kids a learning environment that works for them. And then finally, I don't appreciate the fact that we had the test kids coming straight out of COVID. I know a lot of that was based off of strings attached to federal funding, but I don't like it. And I think it was definitely disruptive and problematic. I would have preferred that we found a way to be more creative and get an exemption.